There is a specific kind of magic that happens between two people on screen that no amount of money, no amount of studio engineering, no carefully designed franchise blueprint can manufacture. It either exists or it doesn't. And when it does exist, when two performers find each other in the middle of a story and something ignites between them that is bigger than either one of them individually, audiences feel it in their bones. They don't need a critic to tell them. They don't need a review. They just know. The air in the theater changes. Something real is happening. Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker found that magic in 1998. In a buddy cop movie that nobody expected to explode the way it did, that came in with modest expectations and left with over $240 million worldwide and a cultural footprint that would outlast every forecast. And then they found it again in 2001, in a sequel that somehow matched the original's energy and then pushed past it, delivering one of the better action comedy follow-ups Hollywood had produced in years. By 2007, when Rush Hour 3 finally arrived, 6 years after the second film, an eternity in franchise years, the question was no longer whether Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker had chemistry. Everyone already knew they did. The question was something quieter and more uncomfortable than that. The question was, does the magic hold when everything around it has changed? When the performers are older, when the genre has shifted, when 6 years of absence has allowed the audience to move on and come back with higher expectations than a franchise can easily meet. That question, and the complicated, imperfect, genuinely interesting answer the film gives to it, is what we are going to spend the next hour and a half exploring. Because Rush Hour 3 is not the movie critics said it was in 2007. It is also not the triumph that franchise loyalists wanted it to be. It is something stranger and more honest than either of those readings. A film caught between what it was and what it was trying to become, carrying the weight of a legacy it both honors and struggles under, and occasionally, in the moments when it stops worrying about all of that and just lets its two lead performers breathe, achieving something genuinely joyful and alive. But to understand where Rush Hour 3 lands, you have to understand where Rush Hour began. And the beginning is a story about two men who had absolutely no business working together, who came from completely different worlds and completely different performance traditions, and who somehow found each other at exactly the right moment. Jackie Chan by 1998 was already a legend in Asia, had been for decades. His work in Hong Kong cinema, his collaboration with directors like Sammo Hung, his own self-directed masterpieces of physical comedy and legitimate death-defying stunt work had established him as something that had never quite existed before in film. He was not just an action star. He was a filmmaker, a choreographer, a physical comedian of the highest order, a man whose entire body was his instrument and who used it with a precision and an artistry that put him in the company of Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd in the great tradition of physical storytelling. His stunt work was not metaphor. He genuinely broke his nose, his cheekbones, his ankle, his kneecap. He fell off actual buildings. He hit actual pavement. There is behind-the-scenes footage of Chan recovering from injuries that would end most careers, grinning through the pain because the shot was worth it. But American audiences had not quite cracked the code on him yet. Rumble in the Bronx had found an audience in 1995. The first strike had done reasonably well. But Jackie Chan as a fully formed American movie star, that had not happened. Not yet. Chris Tucker was 25 years old in 1997, coming off Friday and Money Talks and the beginnings of what looked like a meteoric rise. He was fast. Not just quick in his delivery but fast in his thinking, fast in his reactions, fast in the way he processed the world and turned it into comedy. His stand-up roots gave him a physical presence that was genuinely electric on screen. He was a performer who seemed to be making discoveries in real time, whose reactions felt spontaneous in the way that the best comedy always does, even when it is meticulously rehearsed. The two of them together under Brett Ratner's direction, with a script that was smart enough to know it was not the story and dumb enough to get out of the way of its own leads. That combination produced something that felt effortless. The cultural gap between Lee and Carter, the formal reserve of the Hong Kong detective and the unbridled chaos of the LAPD detective, the way they drove each other insane and saved each other's lives and genuinely, visibly liked each other underneath all the bickering. It worked. It worked in ways that surprised everyone, including probably the studio. Rush Hour 2 arrived in 2001 with the confidence of a film that knew what it was and where it stood. Bigger budget. Hong Kong setting. More elaborate action sequences. A villain in Rosalind Sanchez's Isabella that gave the film genuine menace. The chemistry between Chan and Tucker was, if anything, sharper. They had found their rhythm by then, found the specific comedic language they spoke together, and they deployed it with the assurance of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The film made $230 million on a $90 million budget and was the second highest grossing film of the weekend it opened, behind only Planet of the Apes. Rush Hour 2 was, by any measure, a success. And then 6 years of silence. The reasons for the gap are interesting and have been discussed enough that there is no need to revisit them in forensic detail. There were negotiations, there were scheduling conflicts, there were salary discussions that became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Tucker, who had reportedly been paid $20 million for Rush Hour 2, was not going to accept less for the third installment, and the studio's willingness to meet that number came slowly and with conditions. Chan had other projects, other films, other commitments in multiple countries simultaneously. Brett Ratner had other work. And there was, perhaps most significantly, the question of whether anyone had a story worth telling, because a third Rush Hour film needed to justify its own existence, needed to offer something beyond pure fan service, needed to give Lee and Carter somewhere new to go. The answer the production eventually settled on was Paris, which is, cinematically, one of the great correct instincts. Paris is the most visually cinematic city in the world in a specific way, a city that the camera loves, a city where even the most generic tourism shot looks like art because the architecture and the light and the proportions of the street are genuinely extraordinary. Paris has been the backdrop of great films since cinema began. Carries weight, carries atmosphere. It carries the specific romance and danger of a place that has been simultaneously celebrated and contested for centuries. And it carries a certain tonal lightness that the filmmakers wanted. The lightness of a film that knows it is not trying to reinvent itself or make some grand statement, that is trying to give audiences a good time in beautiful surroundings with two performers they already love. That ambition is not contemptible. It is, in fact, the most honest possible framing for a third entry in a buddy cop franchise. The question is not whether Rush Hour 3 had the most ambitious goals. The question is whether it achieved what it was trying to achieve. Let's follow the film from the beginning because the beginning matters enormously, both for what it delivers and for what it reveals about the tonal choices the filmmakers were making. We open in Los Angeles. Ambassador Han, the character who has been the connective tissue of the Rush Hour franchise since the first film, the man whose kidnapped daughter drove the original plot and whose relationship with Lee represents one of the series' more emotionally grounded elements, is delivering a speech at the World Criminal Court, about to name the leaders of the triads. This is not a small thing. This is a man putting his life on the line to bring down an international criminal organization, choosing transparency and justice over self-preservation. It is, in its way, a moment of genuine civic courage. And then a sniper fires. The assassination attempt on Ambassador Han is where the film begins its story in earnest, and it is handled with a kinetic efficiency that reminds you, immediately, why Brett Ratner is good at this. The chaos of the shooting, the immediate scramble, the way the scene establishes physical space and threat and urgency in quick, clean visual strokes. It is action filmmaking that does its job without drawing attention to itself. And then Inspector Lee is there because of course Lee is there, because Lee is always where he needs to be, because this franchise has always understood that its emotional core is Lee's absolute loyalty to Ambassador Han and by extension to everything Han represents. Lee does not save Han with elaborate choreography in this opening. He saves him with his body, throws himself between the bullet and the man he would die for. It is a clear, decisive moment of character. And it sets the emotional stakes for everything that follows, because Han survives but is critically wounded, and the man responsible for the shooting escapes, and Lee is left standing in the wreckage of the attempt with a name, Kenji, that carries more weight than simply a suspect's identity. Kenji. The name lands on Lee like a physical blow, because Kenji is not just the shooter. Kenji is someone Lee knows, someone from his past. And the film, to its credit, does not immediately explain this. It lets the weight of that name settle, lets the audience feel that there is a history here, before it opens the compartment and shows you what's inside. Meanwhile, Carter is directing traffic. I love this. I genuinely love this as a character choice, as a scene, as a piece of comedic construction that is also doing real emotional work. Carter has been busted down to traffic duty. He is standing in an intersection with a whistle and a pair of white gloves, and he is making it a performance because Carter cannot help making everything a performance, because his entire relationship with the world is that of a man who is always performing, always in front of an audience even when there is no audience, always giving it everything he has even when everything he has is wildly inappropriate for the context. The comedy of this scene is obvious and it lands beautifully. Tucker's physical performance, the elaborate arm signals, the way he escalates from traffic direction into something closer to a dance, is a reminder of how technically skilled a comedian he is. But underneath the comedy is a piece of character information. Carter has been demoted. Something happened between films, some Carter-shaped catastrophe that resulted in him being moved from detective work to traffic control. We don't know the specifics, and the film doesn't belabor them, but the fact of it tells you something about the trajectory of Carter's career. The genius is that Carter doesn't seem particularly bothered by it. He has found a way to make even traffic duty magnificent, because that is who he is, that is his particular and undefeatable relationship with the world. And then Lee pulls up, and the partnership that defines the franchise is back in motion. The transition from Carter's traffic direction stand-up set to the beginning of the actual story is one of the film's most elegant structural moves. It gets you the comedy, it gives you the character, and then it snaps the plot into focus before you even realize the gears have shifted. This is Ratner at his most competent. The machinery is invisible. The story just moves. Lee tells Carter about Han, about Kenji, about Paris. And Carter, being Carter, hears the word Paris and is immediately in, for reasons that have nothing to do with Ambassador Han or criminal justice and everything to do with Carter's extremely specific vision of Paris as the city where every romantic and cinematic dream he has ever had will somehow be realized. This is both funny and, in a very Carter way, completely correct. The film is partly going to be a comedy of Carter's Paris fantasies colliding with the reality of being a fugitive in a city where he doesn't speak the language and everyone is trying to kill him, and the setup of those expectations in this early scene is good screenwriting. The flight to Paris gives the film one of its early extended comedy sequences, and it is one of those sequences that lives or dies on Chris Tucker's ability to command 20 continuous seconds of escalating absurdity without losing the audience. He does not lose the audience. He has never lost the audience. Tucker's particular skill, the skill that made him a genuine star and that this franchise showcases better than anything else he has done, is his ability to escalate. Most comedians know how to be funny. Fewer know how to keep being funnier. Tucker does it instinctively, hitting beats that seem improvised even when they are clearly prepared, carrying the audience up a curve of escalating ridiculousness without ever tipping over into the territory of too much. Lee watches all of this with the quiet, long-suffering patience of a man who has accepted that this is simply his life now. Jackie Chan's comedic skill in the Rush Hour films is often undervalued because it operates through restraint rather than expansion. Where Tucker is all forward motion and escalation, Chan is stillness and reaction, and the contrast between the two is what creates the specific texture of their comedy together. Lee does not have to do anything when Carter is doing something. He simply has to be there, registering, absorbing, occasionally responding with the specific expression of a man who has tried reason and found it insufficient. Paris arrives, and the film puts its visual cards on the table immediately. The Eiffel Tower, the Seine, cobblestones and cafe awnings, and the kind of golden afternoon light that makes every surface look like it belongs in a Renoir painting. Ratner and his cinematographer J. Michael Morrow understand that Paris is doing a significant amount of the film's atmospheric work for free, and they are smart enough not to get in the way of it. The city photographs itself. All you have to do is point the camera and let it breathe. But Paris also brings the film's central mystery into sharper focus, because Paris is where Kenji is, and Paris is where the Triads have their European operations, and Paris is where a list exists. A list of Triad leaders, the same list Ambassador Han was about to reveal when the sniper's bullet interrupted him. This list is the MacGuffin around which the film organizes its plot, and it is a functional MacGuffin in the sense that it gives every character a clear and consistent reason to do what they are doing. The stakes are concrete. The objective is clear. The opposing forces are defined. What is less clear and more emotionally interesting is the question of Kenji. Seiichi Tanaka plays Kenji with a controlled intensity that makes him genuinely compelling as an antagonist in the film's quieter moments. Not a scenery-chewing villain, not a cartoon, but a man who has made choices that put him in direct opposition to Lee and who understands exactly what those choices mean. The relationship between Lee and Kenji is revealed gradually, in pieces, and it is the film's most genuinely affecting dramatic element when it works, which, it should be said, is intermittently. The backstory of their connection, the orphanage, the brotherhood that existed before their paths diverged so completely, has the potential to generate real emotional resonance. Whether the film fully capitalizes on that potential is a question we will return to. There is also Genevieve, played by Noémie Lenoir. The French connection in the most literal and the most plot-relevant sense. She is the woman who holds the key to the list, who exists in the space between the worlds of criminal enterprise and potential redemption, and whose relationship with the investigation provides the film with its romantic subplot. Lenoir is luminous, genuinely, photographically luminous, the kind of screen presence that makes the camera lean slightly toward her regardless of what anyone else in the frame is doing. She is also, and the film is aware of this even if it does not entirely manage the awareness, somewhat underwritten. Genevieve is where she needs to be when she needs to be there. Her motivations are consistent but thin. The film uses her beauty and her mystery more than it uses her interiority. But the scene where Carter first encounters Genevieve is one of the film's highlights regardless, because Tucker's reaction, the specific, barely contained joy of a man for whom Paris has just become everything he hoped and nothing he expected, is something that you cannot stage. That kind of comedic reaction requires an actor who is genuinely responding to what is in front of him, who allows himself to be surprised, who does not preload the punchline. Tucker is responding to Noémie Lenoir, and Noémie Lenoir makes that easy, and the scene crackles with the energy of two attractive people in a beautiful city with absolutely nothing in common and absolutely every reason to be in the same place at the same time. The triad sequences move the film into territory that Rush Hour has always handled with confident efficiency, the action set pieces. And here, the film is at its most comfortably itself. Jackie Chan, at 53 during production, is working within limitations that he had not been working within during the first Rush Hour films, and the honest thing to say is that those limitations are visible. This is not a criticism of Chan, it is a statement of simple physical reality, and it is a reality that Chan himself has spoken about with characteristic honesty and grace. The stunt work in Rush Hour 3 is not the stunt work of Police Story or Drunken Master or even the first Rush Hour film. Cannot be. The body that performed those impossible feats has accumulated decades of damage, and demanding that it perform at the same level is both impossible and, frankly, would be unkind. What Chan does instead is work smarter. The fight choreography in Rush Hour 3 is designed around speed and efficiency rather than the extended acrobatic showpieces of his Hong Kong work, shorter combinations, quicker resolutions, an emphasis on using the environment rather than on lengthy one-on-one exchanges that would require prolonged athletic effort. And the fights that result are still extremely good. Chan's fundamental skill, his ability to make combat look simultaneously effortful and playful, to find the humor in physical conflict without undermining the stakes, to use props and furniture and architecture as part of the choreography, is entirely intact. He has simply translated it into a register appropriate for where his body actually is. There is a sequence in a Parisian restaurant that deserves particular attention, because it demonstrates exactly this translation. The confined space, the presence of diners, the various props available in a restaurant environment, tables, chairs, wine bottles, serving trays, all become part of the choreography in ways that are inventive and funny and occasionally genuinely impressive. It is not the Eiffel Tower scaffolding sequence of the original Rush Hour's police station fight or the casino sequence of Rush Hour 2. But it is alive and creative and unmistakably Chan, and if you watch it with attention rather than with nostalgia for what his earlier work looked like, it rewards that attention. The nun sequence. I need to talk about the nun sequence because it is one of those moments in the rush hour films where the comedy and the action and the absurdism all pile on top of each other in a way that should not work and absolutely does. Without giving away the full context too quickly, Lee and Carter, in the course of their investigation, find themselves involved with a martial arts expert who is disguised as a nun in a convent in Paris, and the resulting fight sequence manages to be simultaneously funny and genuinely action-packed in a way that requires a certain kind of tonal precision to land. Too far toward comedy and the action becomes slapstick. Too far toward action and the comedy becomes awkward. The film finds the middle ground and plants its flag there, and the result is a sequence that encapsulates everything the Rush Hour franchise does when it is operating at its best. The Eiffel Tower. Let's go to the Eiffel Tower. Because of course Rush Hour 3 goes to the Eiffel Tower. Of course it does. You make a Rush Hour film set in Paris and not end up on the Eiffel Tower, and you have failed some fundamental law of franchise physics. The tower has appeared in probably more action films than any other single structure outside of Manhattan skyscrapers. And yet there is something about it that makes it cinematically irresistible. Its height, its latticed iron structure that offers handholds and climbing routes and dramatic framing angles, its status as a symbol of something aspirational and romantic that is instantly understandable to a global audience. It is the world's most efficient communicator of, we are in Paris and something important is happening. The Eiffel Tower climax uses the structure effectively. The chase and confrontation that takes place on and around it has genuine vertical energy, and Ratner stages the action on those iron girders with an eye for the spatial drama available when you put people very high up and very close to open air. The wind, the scale, the way the city spreads out below in a panorama that reminds you exactly how high above the ground the characters are. These are not just visual flourishes. They are tension mechanics. They are the director using environment to generate stakes that the plot alone might not fully carry. And at the top, or near the top, in the sequence's emotional climax, is the confrontation between Lee and Kenji that the entire film has been building toward. This is the moment the film needs to earn, and whether it earns it is the most interesting question the script raises. Here is what the scene is doing and why it matters. Kenji and Lee are brothers in everything except blood, raised together, shaped by the same formative experiences, diverged at some point along the way into opposite sides of the same moral equation. Lee became the defender of order. Kenji became something else entirely. And the film has been quietly, carefully laying in the emotional weight of this relationship throughout. In Lee's reaction when Kenji's name is first mentioned, in the way Lee pursues Kenji with an intensity that goes beyond professional obligation, in the specific grief that lives in Lee's face when he has to confront what Kenji has become. The confrontation on the Eiffel Tower asks the question that every story about brothers and betrayal eventually asks. Can you do what needs to be done when what needs to be done requires you to hurt someone you love? Can loyalty to a principle override loyalty to a person? And is the action that principle demands, in this case stopping Kenji definitively, something that can be survived emotionally, or does it leave a wound that does not heal? Jackie Chan plays this scene with genuine emotional transparency, which is one of the qualities of his screen presence that sometimes gets overlooked in favor of his physical abilities. Chan does not hide behind the action. When Lee is carrying something emotionally difficult, it registers in his face, in his body, in the specific quality of stillness that he brings to quiet, dramatic moments. The confrontation with Kenji is one of those moments, and Chan is present for it in a way that elevates the material. The resolution of the Kenji storyline is bittersweet in the way that the best buddy action film villain resolutions are not triumphant, not clean, not free of cost. Something is lost. Something that cannot be replaced. And the film does not pretend otherwise. It sits with that loss for a moment, briefly, before the final beats pull back toward the lighter register that the franchise requires. That moment of sitting with the loss is important. It is the film insisting, against the pressure of its own genre requirements, that consequences are real, that choices have weight, that even in a world where good guys win and bad guys lose, winning sometimes costs something. Carter, throughout the climax, is doing what Carter does, which is to say he is making impossible things happen through a combination of luck and instinct and a refusal to acknowledge that what he is attempting is impossible. Tucker's physical comedy in the Eiffel Tower sequence is genuinely impressive in ways that do not require qualification. He is not a trained martial artist or stunt performer, but he commits with his whole body and his whole self, and the commitment sells every beat. There is a sequence involving a rope and the physics of a very tall structure and the specific terror of heights that Tucker plays with a combination of genuine fear and desperate bravado that is one of his best pure physical comedy moments in the franchise. And the dynamic between Lee and Carter, in the middle of all of this action and consequence and emotional weight, it remains the film's most reliable source of both comedy and genuine feeling. There is a moment, amid the chaos of the tower sequence, where the two of them exchange a look that requires no dialogue. A look that says, "We have been through too much together for any of this to change what we are to each other." A look that is, in the vocabulary of the Rush Hour films, "I love you, man," translated into eye contact and perfect comedic timing. Tucker and Chan do this with a naturalness that comes from genuine affection. They like each other visibly in all three films, and that visible affection is the irreducible magic at the center of the franchise. You cannot fake it. It is there or it isn't. And it is there. Now, let me step out of the story for a moment and talk about what Rush Hour 3 actually is in the context of action comedy as a genre, because I think the film deserves to be understood in that context rather than simply in comparison to its predecessors. The buddy cop film has a specific and important history in American cinema. 48 Hours, Lethal Weapon, Beverly Hills Cop, Midnight Run. These are the genre's foundational texts, and each of them established certain conventions that subsequent films either honored or violated at their peril. The conventions are two protagonists with fundamentally different personalities and worldviews who are forced into partnership, whose personal conflict mirrors and deepens the external plot, who are changed by their encounter with each other in ways that are both specific and permanent. The comedy comes from the personality gap. The drama comes from the stakes. The emotional payoff comes from the partnership. Rush Hour understood all of this and executed it with real intelligence, particularly in its use of the Chan-Tucker dynamic to add a racial and cultural dimension to the personality gap that the genre had not previously explored with that degree of specificity and genuine warmth. The friction between Lee and Carter was not just personality friction. It was cultural friction, the collision of different ways of understanding authority, community, obligation, loyalty, communication. And the film took that collision seriously, even while mining it for comedy, because it understood that the most durable comedy comes from truth. Rush Hour 3 inherits all of this. It does not reinvent it. And the question of whether it needed to reinvent it is, honestly, a more complicated question than it might appear. There is a school of film criticism that holds that sequels must justify their existence by doing something new, by expanding the universe or the characters or the themes in ways that make the new installment more than a repetition of the original experience. And there is something to this. The best sequels, The Empire Strikes Back, The Godfather Part 2, Toy Story 2, do add something. They go somewhere the original could not have predicted. But there is another equally legitimate tradition of sequel making, one that holds that if you have found something genuinely excellent, the goal is not to replace it but to deliver it again with enough craft and enough freshness that the audience leaves satisfied. This is the tradition of the well-made genre picture, the commitment to executing a known form with skill and care and enough personality to make it feel alive rather than mechanical. Rush Hour 2 largely succeeded in this tradition. Rush Hour 3 succeeds in it partially, inconsistently, and most fully in the moments when it trusts its performers enough to get out of their way. Where it struggles, and we should be honest about this, is in its plotting. The triad storyline in Rush Hour 3 is competent but thin, carrying less menace and less elegance than the criminal conspiracies in the first two films. The villains, with the exception of Kenji, are more functional than memorable. They are obstacles rather than characters, forces that the plot requires rather than people that the film has genuinely imagined. This is a recurring weakness in franchise action films at their third chapter, when the writers have already used their best villain concepts and must work harder to generate antagonist freshness. The pacing in the second act has patches of genuine unevenness, Moments where the film seems unsure whether it wants to develop the Kenji emotional thread further or whether it wants to deliver another comedy sequence. And in the uncertainty between those two impulses, it occasionally does neither as fully as it should. There are scenes that feel like they belong to a more emotionally complex film and scenes that feel like they belong to a broader, sillier film, and the transition between them is sometimes abrupt enough to create a kind of tonal whiplash. The film is also clearly influenced by the particular movie landscape of 2007 in ways that have not aged uniformly well. The Bourne franchise had reshaped the action film conversation by this point, and audiences were being trained toward a grittier, more physically grounded action aesthetic that Rush Hour 3's lighter, more stylized approach was swimming against. The film did not try to be Bourne wisely because that would have been a category error, but it existed in a marketplace that Bourne had recalibrated, and the reviews reflected a critical community that had moved on from the tonal register Rush Hour occupied. The box office tells an interesting story on its own. Rush Hour 3 opened to $67 million in North America, making it one of the bigger openings of that August, and went on to earn over $250 million worldwide. More than either of its predecessors in raw dollar terms, though less impressive when adjusted for ticket price inflation. The film made money. Significant money. The audience came. The audience, in sufficient numbers, enjoyed what they found when they got there. The critical reception, a Rotten Tomatoes score in the low 20s at the time, which has since been somewhat revised, was dramatically out of step with the audience response, which is itself a data point worth examining. Critics in 2007 were evaluating Rush Hour 3 against a set of genre expectations that had shifted significantly since 2001. They were also, in some cases, evaluating it against the specific emotional experience of the first Rush Hour film, the surprise, the delight, the genuine novelty of that chemistry in 1998. Rush Hour 3 cannot replicate that novelty, because novelty by definition cannot be replicated. It can only offer what it has, which is those two performers, that chemistry, that relationship in a new setting with a new story. And for the audience that came to the theaters in August 2007, that was apparently enough. Or at least enough for a summer Friday night with some popcorn. The question of Roman Polanski's cameo deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of the stranger and more interesting choices in the film, and because it is handled with a kind of knowing absurdism that is genuinely funny if you are paying attention. Polanski, the director, the controversial figure, the man with a specific and complicated history in both cinema and in his own legal narrative, appears as a French police inspector who interrogates Lee and Carter at the airport. And he plays it with complete, dry commitment, as a character who is exactly as oblivious to the absurdity of his own authority as real authority figures tend to be. The scene works as comedy. It works as a specific kind of French cinematic in-joke. And it represents a degree of meta-awareness on the film's part, a willingness to wink at the audience while delivering the gag straight. That is one of the Rush Hour franchise's consistent pleasures. The George Takei cameo is also worth noting, for different reasons. Takei appears as a character who turns out to speak no Japanese, despite appearances suggesting otherwise, in a bit that plays on the specific comedy of assumptions and cultural signaling that the Rush Hour films have always been willing to examine with good humor. It is a quick joke, but it is a smart quick joke, the kind that comes from writers who understand the comedic potential of challenging the audience's own assumptions about who people are based on how they look. Let me talk about the music, because the Rush Hour films have always had a specific relationship with their soundtracks that is worth examining. The franchise has used hip-hop and R&B throughout, and Rush Hour 3 continues this tradition with a sound that is distinctly mid-2000s, the particular sonic texture of that era, with its heavy bass and its specific production aesthetic, which dates the film in some ways while also giving it a very clear sense of its own moment. Lalo Schifrin, who had scored the first two films, is back, and his orchestral contributions give the action sequences a classical muscle that grounds the hip-hop elements. The tonal range of the score, from the comedic bounce of Carter's scenes to the genuine tension of the thriller sequences to the emotional register of the Lee Kenji confrontation, is broader than the score usually gets credit for. There is a specific scene where Carter sings, Chris Tucker, who is a genuine musician outside of his acting career, using his actual voice in a scene that is simultaneously a character moment and a comedy beat and a showcase for a talent that the franchise has never quite fully deployed. The moment is brief. It is also genuinely lovely. And it sits in the film as a small, quiet demonstration of what this franchise had access to that it did not always fully use. Because that is, ultimately, the honest and somewhat bittersweet conclusion you reach when you spend serious time with Rush Hour 3. You see the outline of a richer film. You see the emotional architecture that the Kenji storyline could have built if the screenplay had given it more room. You see the Paris setting doing its work, but sometimes feeling like window dressing rather than fully integrated location storytelling. You see two performers, Tucker and Chan, who are demonstrably, undeniably capable of something extraordinary together, and who are given material that is good but not great, that serves the franchise competently but does not challenge them in the way that would have produced their best work. Jackie Chan at his most emotionally engaged, when the material gives him something to carry, something beyond the physical, is an actor of genuine depth and intelligence. The Lee-Kenji relationship offered that. The film develops it only to a point. Push it further, give it more scenes and more revelation and more of the specific grief of a man who has spent his life trying to be good and must now confront what that goodness has cost him in terms of the people he could not hold on to. Push it to that place, and you have a Rush Hour film that stands alongside the best entries in the franchise rather than below them. Chris Tucker, for his part, is operating at a level of pure comedic craft that the critical reception in 2007 genuinely undervalued. Watching Rush Hour 3 now, with some distance from the critical narrative that surrounded it on release, what you see in Tucker's performance is extraordinary control. The timing, the physical commitment, the way he finds a beat inside a beat, a joke within a joke, a specific piece of human truth inside even the broadest comedy. There is a scene where Carter is on the phone, speaking in mangled French to someone who does not understand him, and what Tucker does in that scene, the escalation, the increasing desperation, the specific comedy of a man who refuses to accept that communication has failed, is technically flawless. It is not a scene anyone will write essays about. It is a scene that would vanish entirely without the right performer. With Tucker, it is the kind of scene you rewind. There is also, underneath all the comedy and the action and the Paris travelogue, a thread of emotional truth running through the film that deserves acknowledgement. The Rush Hour films are, at their core, about friendship. About the specific kind of friendship that forms between people who have no obvious reason to be friends, who are different in ways that should be incompatible, who come from worlds that do not easily map onto each other, and who choose each other anyway, who show up for each other anyway, who, when things go badly wrong in a tower in Paris or a warehouse in Hong Kong or a police station in Los Angeles, are still there, still together, still making the impossible work through sheer combined force of will and the particular alchemy of their bond. Carter shows up at the beginning of the film. Lee calls, Lee needs him, and Carter, currently directing traffic in an LAPD intersection, presumably due to some Carter-adjacent catastrophe that we will never fully know the details of, drops everything and goes. Not because he is professionally obligated to. Not because he has been assigned. Because Lee needs him. That is the whole reason. And that uncomplicated, unqualified loyalty is the film's most honest emotional note. And it is sounded in the first 10 minutes and maintained throughout every comedy bit and action sequence and Paris tourism moment that follows. By the time the film reaches its final beats, the denouement, the quiet scene after the chaos, the specific quality of silence that follows when the thread is resolved and the adrenaline clears, and what you are left with is just two people who have been through something together and are sitting in the aftermath of it. Rush Hour 3 earns something. It earns the moment. Not through the action or the comedy or the Paris setting or the villain or the plot, but through the simple, durable, endlessly renewable appeal of these two specific human beings being themselves at each other. There is a version of film criticism that would say that is not enough. That competent execution of a familiar formula, delivered by familiar performers in a franchise's third entry, is not sufficient justification for the film's existence. That the missed opportunities, the fuller Kenji story, the more deeply integrated Paris location, the more ambitious tonal range, represent a failure of ambition that cannot be compensated by execution alone. And there is another version of film criticism, the version that is interested in what films actually do to the people watching them in real time, in real theaters, eating real popcorn and choosing to spend 2 hours in the company of something. That would say, A film that makes you laugh this consistently, that delivers these performances with this much energy, that gives you a genuine emotional moment in the middle of a tower in Paris and earns it through careful character work, is not failing. It is doing something. It is delivering something specific and real and valuable to a specific and real audience. Rush Hour 3 is not the best Rush Hour film. That designation belongs to the original, for the simple reason that you cannot recreate a first encounter, cannot replicate the specific charge of meeting Lee and Carter for the first time and feeling that chemistry ignite. It is probably the second best Rush Hour film, which makes it the best of the available alternatives, which is a somewhat backhanded compliment but also, honestly, a real one. It is a film made by professionals who knew what they were doing, starring performers of genuine talent and genuine warmth, set in one of the world's most beautiful cities, delivering comedy that works and action that functions and an emotional thread that, when it lands with real feeling. It is a summer movie in the fullest sense, designed for warmth and entertainment and the specific pleasure of a franchise check-in, of visiting characters you missed and finding that the visit was worth the trip. The question I asked at the beginning, does the magic hold when everything around it has changed, has an answer now, and the answer is mostly, imperfectly, with qualifications, but mostly yes. The magic holds because the magic was always the two of them together, and the two of them together is still something that a camera cannot help but love and an audience cannot help but respond to. The franchise, the setting, the plot, the years between films, all of that is context. The relationship is the thing, and the relationship in Rush Hour 3 still breathes. On a technical filmmaking scale, Rush Hour 3 is a competent 7. Well shot, well performed, occasionally inspired, more often reliable. In terms of its emotional delivery, its comedy, its sheer watchability on a Friday night when you want to be entertained and not challenged, it climbs to an 8. As a legacy piece, as the final installment of a franchise that genuinely mattered, that gave the world two performances that people still quote and still love and still watch and still feel something watching, it is something harder to quantify and more than the numbers suggest. It is a 9 for the moments when Tucker and Chan are just being themselves together and you remember why you loved them in the first place. When Carter says something that makes Lee shake his head with that specific long-suffering affection. When Lee does something physically extraordinary and Carter's reaction is more honest than any scripted line could be. When the two of them are standing somewhere in Paris with the lights coming on along the Seine and the absurdity of everything they have just survived hanging between them like something they can only laugh about, because laughing about it is the only alternative to something much harder. In those moments, and Rush Hour 3 has enough of them to justify the trip, the magic is completely, undeniably, unmistakably there. Do you hear that? That sound underneath everything? That's Chris Tucker laughing at a joke that just occurred to him, somewhere between a rooftop and a car chase and a city that was born to be beautiful. And Jackie Chan is already shaking his head, because he knows what is coming and he is going to have to deal with it. And the lights of Paris are coming on one by one across the river, and the night is just beginning, and whatever comes next, they are going to face it together. That, in the end, is what Rush Hour always was. Two people, one world, all the chaos it could throw at them, and the stubborn, undefeatable fact of their friendship holding through all of it. 7.5 out of 10. And honestly, on the right night, with the right company, in exactly the right mood, call it an 8. Because it makes you feel something. And in a world with too many films that feel like nothing at all, that counts for more than the critics gave it credit for. Do you copy? Yeah. I copy. Let me go back and spend more time inside the specific scenes because I moved through some of them too quickly, and the specific scenes are where the film's real texture lives. The texture that separates a recap from an experience. The texture that makes the difference between knowing what happens and feeling what happens. The opening assassination sequence. Let's really be there for it. You are in Los Angeles. You are at the World Criminal Court building. It is daylight, clean and hard and Californian. The kind of light that offers no shadows to hide in. Ambassador Han is at the podium. He is a man who carries himself with the specific dignity of someone who has decided to spend whatever political and personal capital he has accumulated on a single irreversible act of transparency. He is about to give up names. He is about to make enemies of people who destroy their enemies with efficiency and without sentiment. He knows this. The film communicates it in the way he pauses before speaking, just a fraction of a second, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. And then the glass breaks, and the world changes. The sniper's shot comes from a building across the street, through the security of the occasion, through the distance that was supposed to make Han untouchable. And Lee, who has been in that room, who has been watching the exits and the sight lines with the permanent, low-grade alertness of a man who has spent his entire career anticipating catastrophe, moves before the sound finishes. He is across the room before conscious thought because this is what Lee is, not a strategist in the moment of crisis. An instinct, a body that knows what to do before the mind has finished processing that something needs to be done. He throws himself between Han and whatever is coming next. And in that fraction of a second, the film restates everything it has ever told you about who Lee is and what drives him. He is not protecting Han because it is his job. His job is a framework for something deeper, the specific, non-transferable loyalty of a man who was shaped by someone else's care and who has organized his entire adult life around repaying a debt that the other party does not consider a debt at all. Han took Lee in some form at some point in Lee's history that the films gesture toward without fully specifying. And the gift of that, of being seen and valued and trusted by someone when you were young and needed it, is the kind of gift that some people spend their lives repaying. Lee is one of those people. When Han falls, when the blood appears, when the controlled horror of the scene registers on Lee's face, that is not professional crisis management. That is personal devastation. Chan plays it as both simultaneously, because Lee is a professional who does not allow himself to fall apart, who acts before he feels, who will feel it all later in private. But the feeling is there, underneath the action, informing every choice. You can see it. If you are watching Chan's eyes rather than the choreography of the scene, you can see exactly what this moment costs him. And then Kenji's face. Just for a second. The sniper, revealed, not yet identified to the audience, not yet named. Just a face. A face that means something to Lee, that registers in Lee's expression with a recognition that is also a wound. Watching it, that this is not a stranger. You do not yet know why, but you know. That is excellent filmmaking. That is communicating a piece of emotional information, that this conflict has a personal dimension that the plot has not yet explained, without a single word of exposition. That is the camera doing what the camera does best. Showing you something that tells you everything, while the characters are still in the process of understanding it themselves. The interrogation at the airport when Lee and Carter first arrive in Paris is a masterclass in the specific comedy that the rush hour films do better than almost any franchise since the golden age of the buddy cop genre. And the comedy is doing more than just generating laughs. It is doing character work. Carter's approach to the French inspector, played by Polanski with that bone-dry authority, is Carter's approach to all authority that he does not respect and has not decided to respect on his own terms. He is not insubordinate in the aggressive sense. He is insubordinate in the most distinctly Carter sense, which is that he does not acknowledge the authority as authority. He treats it as theater. He responds to the power structure as though the power structure is a performance he has the option of critiquing rather than a reality he is required to submit to. This is, when you think about it, the core of Carter as a character and also the core of his comedy. Carter does not experience institutional authority as binding. He experiences it as conversational, a position from which some people are speaking, from which he may choose to respond or not respond, with which he is free to disagree loudly and publicly and without apparent concern for consequences. This is, of course, precisely why Carter gets busted down to traffic duty. This is also precisely why Carter is, when the chips are down, the person you want in your corner when none of the normal rules are working. Lee's reaction to Carter's interrogation performance is worth examining in its own right. It is not simple exasperation, though exasperation is the surface register. Underneath it is the specific amusement of a man who has long since stopped being genuinely surprised by his partner and has begun, in some quiet corner of himself, to find the predictable unpredictability of it genuinely delightful. Lee has been changed by his friendship with Carter. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in ways the film needs to announce, but in the specific way that anyone is changed by sustained exposure to someone very different from themselves. He is slightly more flexible, slightly less rigid, slightly more capable of seeing that some rules are constructions and that constructions can sometimes, with adequate motivation, be dismantled. Carter has been changed by Lee in the opposite direction, made slightly more disciplined, slightly more focused, slightly better at the moments when discipline and focus are the only things standing between him and catastrophe. Not dramatically, not consistently, but measurably if you are paying attention across all three films. This is what good franchise character writing looks like. Not the dramatic transformation of a character arc that resolves neatly within a single film, but the slow, cumulative, realistic accumulation of influence that happens when two people spend enough time together. The Rush Hour films at their best are about this. About the long, slow education of two people by each other. About friendship as transformation, not the sudden, movie moment transformation of a single climactic realization, but the gradual, barely perceptible transformation that you only notice in retrospect, when you look at who someone was at the beginning and who they are at the end and realize how much distance lies between those 2 points. The scene where Lee and Carter are trying to navigate a Parisian underworld contact is one of those scenes that seems, on the surface, like pure comedy. Two Americans in a French criminal establishment, hopelessly out of their linguistic and cultural depth, improvising their way through a situation that calls for more subtlety than either of them possesses. Tucker's French is a character of its own in this scene. It is not merely bad French, it is French filtered through a specific and deeply American confidence that the performance is going better than it is, that the communication is happening even when it manifestly is not, that Carter's charm can bridge any gap, including the gap between two completely different languages. Cannot, of course. It is not bridging anything. But Carter does not know this, or more precisely, Carter has decided not to know it, which for Carter amounts to the same thing. What makes this scene more than just a language comedy bit, what elevates it into something with genuine character depth, is Lee watching all of this. Lee speaks Cantonese, Mandarin, and some degree of several other Asian languages. He does not speak French. He is as lost as Carter in this specific linguistic environment. But where Carter compensates with volume and confidence, Lee compensates with stillness and observation, watching the room rather than performing for it, reading the body language of the contacts when the words are inaccessible. Lee is gathering information even when he cannot understand the conversation. Carter is generating noise. Together, weirdly and improbably, this combination works because the noise draws attention away from the observation, and the observation finds what the noise flushes out. This is a perfect metaphor for their partnership and for why it succeeds despite all logical predictions that it should not. They do not compensate for each other's weaknesses by becoming more similar. They compensate by being completely, maximally themselves, and trusting that the combination of their differentness will produce something neither one could achieve alone. The taxi driver. I want to spend time on the taxi driver character because he is one of those side characters who elevates every scene he is in without the audience necessarily being able to say why. The driver. An extremely enthusiastic, extremely patriotic American expatriate who is thrilled to encounter other Americans in Paris, and who offers his services not just as a driver but as a guide, a defender, a partner in whatever adventure is unfolding, is played with tremendous committed energy, and the comedy that comes from inserting this very American energy into the very French context of the film has a specific texture that the main cast alone could not generate. He also gives the film a recurring emotional touchstone, a reminder that even in the middle of an international criminal conspiracy, Even when the stakes are life and death, the world still contains people who are genuinely, uncomplicated happy to see you, who will drive you where you need to go and ask for nothing beyond the company. There is something almost wistful about that, in the context of a film about betrayal and duty and the cost of loyalty. The world is mostly people like the taxi driver. People who want to help and want to be useful and want to be part of something that matters, even if all that means is getting you safely from one part of Paris to another. Let me also spend more time with the film's visual language, because the cinematography is doing more than the reviews gave it credit for. Michael Moro's work in Rush Hour 3 makes deliberate use of the contrast between the warm, golden tones of Paris's public spaces, the boulevards and the bridges and the lit cafe windows, and the cooler, harder palette of the film's more overtly threatening spaces. The warehouses, the underground locations, the places where the triad operations run out of sight of the city's surface charm. This is not an accident. This is visual storytelling through color temperature, the use of warmth and coolness to communicate safety and danger, comfort and threat, the Paris of postcards and the Paris of consequence. The nighttime Paris sequences are particularly beautiful, and beauty in action filmmaking is sometimes dismissed as mere aesthetics, as if aesthetics and substance are in opposition. But beauty in film carries emotional information. When Paris at night looks like a Duano photograph, when the rain-slicked streets catch the gold of the streetlights and the shadows are deep and soft, the audience's emotional receptivity increases. The beauty opens a door. The story walks through it. They are not separate. The loveliness of the setting is one of the film's strategic assets, and Moro uses it with intelligence and restraint. The rooftop sequence has a visual grammar all its own. The specific way height changes the camera's relationship to its subjects makes them both more vulnerable and more capable, gives action a vertical dimension that ground-level filming cannot replicate. And in the city of Paris, height also gives you the skyline, gives you the towers and the domes and the characteristic roofline of a city that was planned with aesthetic intention in the late 19th century and has been gratefully photographed ever since. Every chase that goes up in Rush Hour 3 is a chase that gains visual resources. Ratner and Moro are aware of this and use it. The color of Lee's suit throughout the film is worth a brief note. The clean, formal, almost austere palette of Lee's wardrobe throughout the franchise is a visual characterization as much as a costume choice. Lee dresses with precision. He does not use clothing to make a statement because Lee does not need to make statements. He is the statement. The controlled, clean line of everything he wears communicates who he is at a glance, his relationship to order, to discipline, to the specific kind of self-presentation that comes from taking seriously the uniform of the role you have chosen. Carter, in contrast, is a man whose wardrobe expresses something else entirely, the color and the swagger and the deliberate, performative statement of a man who wants to be seen and wants to be seen on his own terms. Their clothing tells you who they are before they open their mouths. It is one of the franchise's quietest and most consistent pieces of visual characterization. There is a moment in the film's third act that I want to return to with more attention than I gave it earlier, because it is the scene where the film's emotional ambitions are most visible and most honest and most in need of defense. It is the scene where Lee and Kenji are no longer chasing each other, no longer performing the choreography of antagonist and protagonist, and are simply in the same space together for the first time, seeing each other clearly after years of divergence and decades of the consequences of that divergence. What the scene requires, what all scenes about brothers on opposite sides of a moral divide require, is that both people be right. Not in the sense that they have both made good choices, but in the sense that each of them can see, completely and honestly, exactly how the other one got to where they are. That the logic of Kenji's path is legible to Lee. That the logic of Lee's path is legible to Kenji. That they are not strangers who happen to end up on opposite sides. They are people who started in the same place and were sorted by something, circumstance, character, the specific accidents of what each of them needed and where they found what they needed into different trajectories. Chan plays this scene with an interiority that the film's surface narrative does not always give him room for. You can see Lee calculating not just tactically but emotionally, not just what his next move needs to be but what this moment means, what it costs, what it changes. You can see him grieving in real time for something that has already been lost and that this confrontation is only now making undeniable. The grief is quiet. It is Chan grief, which is to say it is entirely internal, entirely communicated through small physical signals. The quality of his stillness, the set of his jaw, the specific way he holds himself when he is carrying something heavy. Kenji, in this scene, is not performing villainy. He is explaining himself. And the explanation has the particular quality of explanations made by people who have long since stopped expecting understanding. Not defensive, not apologetic, but simply honest, in the way that honesty becomes possible when the stakes are high enough that pretense is no longer worth the energy. Kenji knows who he became and why he became it. He does not need Lee's forgiveness. He might, somewhere buried, want Lee's understanding. But he is past expecting it. This is where the film is genuinely moving, where it stops being a franchise action comedy and becomes, briefly, a film about two men who loved each other and could not save each other and must now stand in the wreckage of that failure and decide what to do next. The film does not stay in this place as long as the emotional architecture demands. There is a franchise rhythm, a genre clock, that asserts itself and pulls the scene toward its action resolution before the emotional scene has finished what it was doing. This is the most significant creative choice Rush Hour 3 gets wrong. Not any of the individual scenes or performances or action sequences, but this, the decision to not give the Lee-Kenji confrontation the full room it needed to breathe. If there is one change that would have made Rush Hour 3 a great film rather than a very good one, it would have been this. 40 more seconds in that scene. 40 more seconds of two men who were brothers looking at each other with complete, undefended honesty before the next thing happens. 40 seconds of the franchise stopping its clock and letting the human moment play. It would not have cost anything except the courage to slow down. And the film comes close. It gets within reach of it. And then the action resumes and the moment passes, and what you are left with is the echo of something that almost was. But the echo is real. And in cinema, echoes matter. They stay with you. They are what you are hearing hours after the lights come up, when you are trying to figure out why a film left you with more feeling than you expected. Rush Hour 3 is not a perfect film. It does not need to be. It is a film made with craft and genuine affection and two performances that would have elevated lesser material, in a setting that gives the camera no bad angles, doing what buddy action films are supposed to do, giving you energy and laughter and the specific pleasure of watching a great partnership operate under pressure. It stumbles occasionally and recovers every time because the recovery mechanism is always the same. Cut to Carter, cut to Lee, let them be themselves with each other, let the audience remember why they came. Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker made 3 films together. No fourth has come, despite years of rumor and occasional announcement and the hopeful arithmetic of franchise economics. Perhaps a fourth will come. Perhaps the machinery of sequels and reboots and franchise IP management will eventually produce a Rush Hour 4, and perhaps it will be good, and perhaps it will bring those two men together again in a way that captures whatever the original trilogy captured. But if Rush Hour 3 is the last time we see them together, and it remains possible that it is, then it is a decent place to leave them. Not the peak, not the pinnacle, not the film they might have made if everything had aligned perfectly. But a film that delivered what it promised, in Paris, in the dark, with the lights of a beautiful city doing their work outside the frame. A film that reminded us, one more time, why these two men together are worth 3 hours of anyone's life. Lee and Carter. Carter and Lee. The most unlikely partnership in the history of buddy cop cinema, and the most durable, and somewhere in the middle of Rush Hour 3, in a moment between the action beats and the comedy and the Paris skyline, the most genuinely, quietly human. That is what you take home from Rush Hour 3. Not the plot. Not the villain. Not even the Eiffel Tower. You take home the look they exchange when it is over, when the immediate crisis has resolved and the weight of the night is settling and there is nothing left to do except be two people who showed up for each other when it mattered. That look does not need a subtitle. That look is the whole franchise in a single shared glance. 7.5 out of 10. And on the right night, with the right company, when the lights are low and Paris is somewhere in the back of your mind like a postcard you once sent yourself from somewhere you almost believed you could live, it feels exactly like enough. Let me linger for a moment on something that does not get talked about in the context of Rush Hour 3, or in the context of the Rush Hour franchise as a whole, which is what these films meant culturally at the specific moment they arrived, and what they still mean now. 1998 was a particular moment in American cinema. The buddy cop film was not a new form, but the specific form that Rush Hour represented, a black American detective and an Asian detective as equals sharing top billing, sharing the jokes, sharing the hero moments, was newer than it appeared. Hollywood had told buddy cop stories for decades. But the specific pairing of Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan, the fact that neither character was subordinated to the other, the fact that both of them were the hero and both of them were the comedy and both of them were the competence, that carried a meaning beyond the story. Carried the meaning of representation, of visibility, of two faces on a poster that did not conform to the default template of the American action hero, standing together equal, bankable, beloved. This is not something Rush Hour announced. It is not something the films wore on their sleeve as political statement. They were not trying to make a social argument. They were trying to make audiences laugh and cheer and feel good. But the fact of them, the sheer undeniable fact of the box office numbers, of the audiences who came back for 3 films spanning nearly a decade, said something that arguments could not say as cleanly. It said, "These faces sell tickets. These faces deserve to be here. These faces are the lead, not the support, not the comic relief for somebody else's story, not the sidekick with less screen time and fewer good lines. The lead. Both of them." Rush Hour 3 carries that weight forward into 2007, into a different decade with different conversations happening around it, and delivers the same fundamental message through the simple act of continuing to exist and continuing to put these two men at the center of the story. Nothing radical, nothing loud, just here they are, again, still leading, still the most interesting people in the frame. Chris Tucker's career after Rush Hour 3 has been, let's say, deliberately chosen. He has not pursued the volume of projects that his talent and his box office track record would have made available. He has been selective in a way that has sometimes frustrated audiences who wanted more of him on screen. But when you look at his 3 Rush Hour performances taken together, the energy of the first, the confidence of the second, the matured timing of the third, you are looking at one of the most distinctive comedic presences American cinema produced in the 1990s and early 2000s. A comedian of genuine technical skill, operating in a physical and vocal register that nobody else was occupying, in a franchise that gave him room to be completely himself. Jackie Chan's legacy needs no defense and no advocacy from anyone. His contribution to global cinema, not just to action films, not just to Hong Kong cinema, but to the entire grammar of how physical performance and comedy and genuine human warmth can combine in the same body, is incalculable. Rush Hour gave him his American mainstream moment, and he used it with the same commitment and the same physical courage and the same generous humor that defined every frame of his Hong Kong work. Rush Hour 3, even with its compromises and its limitations, is a valid part of that legacy. It is Chan doing what Chan does, adapted for where he was in life at the time, with the grace and the pragmatism of a performer who has always been smarter about his own craft than his harshest critics. The two of them together, in all 3 films, constitute one of the most joyful things that franchise cinema produced in the era between the action comedy golden age of the 1980s and the superhero dominance of the 2010s. They stand in that particular decade of cinema as a reminder that sometimes the best special effects are 2 human beings who genuinely like each other, given material that gets out of their way. Rush Hour 3. Paris. Summer of 2007. The final chapter in a trilogy that was never trying to be art and ended up being something better, something alive and warm and real, something that audiences chose and kept choosing, something that made people laugh in the specific way that shared laughter in a darkened theater is one of the great communal experiences of being human and alive and in a room full of other people who are feeling the same thing. That is worth something. That is worth more than a Rotten Tomatoes score. That is worth exactly whatever you are willing to give it, which for me, after spending all this time with it, is a genuinely felt, unironic 7.5 out of 10, with honest affection and zero apology. The case is closed. Carter out. One thing that deserves its own moment before we close completely is the question of what it means to revisit this film now, in the mid-2020s, looking back at a summer blockbuster from nearly 2 decades ago, and whether the distance changes what you see. It does. It always does. Films change as the world around them changes, as the conversations the culture is having shift, as the people watching them bring different experiences to the screen. Rush Hour 3 in 2007 was a franchise installment arriving late and under scrutiny. Rush Hour 3 now is something more interesting. It is a time capsule of a very specific era of Hollywood blockbuster filmmaking, with its specific aesthetic choices and its specific cultural assumptions and its specific kind of optimistic, broadly commercial entertainment that the 2010s largely replaced with something darker and more serialized. Watching it now, you notice the craft differently. You notice how much work Tucker is doing to make the comedy seem effortless. You notice how precisely Chan is managing his physical performance within the reality of what his body can still do. You notice how the Paris location is used not just as backdrop but as emotional context. The city of romance and light and grand aspirations serving as the setting for a story about friendship and loyalty and the things we owe the people we love. You notice, most of all, that the film has aged better than its critical reception suggested it would. The jokes still land. The action still works. The chemistry is still, improbably and undeniably and completely, there. That is the final word on Rush Hour 3. Not the number. Not the ranking. The fact that it still works. The fact that 2 men on a screen, laughing and fighting and driving each other insane and saving each other's lives in a city that was born to be beautiful, are still worth your time. Still worth the watch. Still the thing that Rush Hour always was at its best and most honest. A good time spent in very good company.